Okay, so before I get into this video, I do want to make a few disclaimers. Number one, this video is from my perspective and I might play the game and think about the game differently than you. I make a lot of guides, I do theory crafting, and I also do speedrunning, which means I do like to figure out and study the most optimum way to play a specific DPS in each different abyss. And also I have done a lot of spreadsheets in the past, but personally these days I like focusing more on the practical gameplay and figuring out what's good through speedrunning the abyss or watching other people's gameplay. So that means if you find yourself disagreeing with a lot of points in the video, maybe you just play the game or think about the game differently than me. The second disclaimer I want to say is that I've been thinking about making this video for a long time. I've been working on this video for quite a while. So this video has nothing to do with any other YouTubers' videos. This video is not a call out. Hopefully you don't think I'm making this video in response to maybe one YouTuber's video or another YouTuber's video. That's definitely not the case. Like I said, I've been thinking about these things for a while and I've been planning to make this video for a while. Also, before I get into the meat of this video, I'm not telling you whether you should pull one of these characters or not. I'm not making a tier list, or I'm not telling you what their pull values are or stuff like that. Personally, I don't really care about those kind of discussions. I'm just sharing my insight. So with that out of the way, I guess we can get on with this video. So basically, there's these three anime characters, Kazuha, Sucrose and Venti. And they've all been out for a long time now. And there's been quite enough time for mainstream opinions and blanket statements to be formed about them. Like I said, some of these things are things I've thought about for a while, but I haven't managed to make a video on it yet. So with Kazuha's rerun banner out, I decided to discuss it. So as a base comparison, I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of people make is focusing too much on the numbers, or the fact that Sucrose is a 4-star and Kazuha or Venti are 5 stars. And you might end up just overlooking the practicality or in-game scenarios. If you compare all three anime characters grouping, Kazuha's skill, you can either tap or hold it depending on how much suction you need or how much of a cooldown you could afford to wait. But his suction pulls enemies right next to your player model. This is very comfortable and practical. With Sucrose, her grouping is pretty good. She has the advantage that both her skill and burst can group, even if you're using sacrificial fragments after that sacrificial fragments has triggered. The downtime on her skill and burst is so high, meaning you can often have periods of fighting ungrouped enemies. And not to mention, let's keep it real, her grouping is more scuffed than Kazuha's. Her burst actually does have a powerful pull. It's got quite a large range she can suck, but it also can throw enemies away. Also, both her skill and burst use targeting. It will target an enemy in front of you, sometimes to the side of you, and I think we all know that can be scuffed as well. In regards to Venti, he does have strong grouping on his burst for about 8 seconds, but that's kind of all he has. He has no grouping on his skill, so in many teams that can be about a 50% downtime where you just have no ability to group. However, because it lasts so long, it can be great for multi-wave fights if enemies spawn around its area, so they can keep getting sucked in. But this can be a disadvantage if enemies spawn on different sides of the map. So his burst after defeating a first set of enemies, it basically stops doing anything. I also think this aspect becomes a big mistake if you might say Venti has the best grouping generally, because its effectiveness can differ wildly depending on the content. There can be content where you need to consistently regroup enemies. In that case, Kazuha having short cooldowns and simply pulling enemies towards the player model, in those fights that can be considered the best grouping. And actually, let's keep it 1,000, that type of content is more common than the Venti type of mobbing content. I think with this, people have the tendency to say that Kazuha is just easier to play for casuals and that Sucrose or Venti could require more skill. But I think that's missing the point, because he probably still would use Kazuha in a skilled speedrun. It's very possible that he can be both casual friendly and hardcore friendly at the same time. And we know this for a fact. It's there to see. He always has high usage rate, often much more than the other anime characters. This shows his friendliness amongst the mainstream. And he's also used in basically all categories of speedrunning ever since he came out. Low budget, medium budget, high budget, with a bunch of different teammates and main DPSs. Obviously, I do want to mention that Venti can be seen a lot in high budget speedruns and speedruns in general, depending on the abyss. And Sucrose can crop up in budget speedruns, but Kazuha is eternal. It is what it is. Like, you can say he's a 5-star or not a must pull, but let's just look at the reality of performance. Okay, so as for the mainstream opinions, you might hear certain generic things like Sucrose is better for vape or melt teams, and Kazuha is better for mono teams or freeze teams. You know, Sucrose is better when needing an anime character on field, or Kazuha has weaker buffs than Sucrose until he's C2, or even you might hear that Venti is the best for grouping. And the truth is, at least the way I play the game, a lot of those statements aren't actually true in practice, especially the comparison saying that Sucrose is better in certain teams and Kazuha needs a weapon or a constellation to be better than her in certain teams. I think a lot of that might be theoretical but might not be practical. So me personally, when I'm browsing Reddit or Discord or YouTube and someone says Sucrose is better in these vape teams or in these melt teams, and Kazuha is better in these other teams, but they're generally very similar and comparable. You know, when I hear that, it makes me want to ask, okay, show me these teams you're talking about, because I can't tell whether that's just a theoretical thing or a spreadsheet thing, or it actually is accurate. So I thought in this video, I'll go through a bunch of teams and at the very least, give my perspective on who I would rather play in each team. Okay, so to start, I guess we can start with Hu Tao. As you know, I've done a lot of guides on her on Discord and YouTube, and I've uploaded tons of speedruns and gameplay of her throughout the years. So you might be asking, who's better with her, Kazuha or Sucrose? So as we know, the most popular Hu Tao teams don't actually use either. Something like this is generally the most popular Hu Tao team. This is because a lot of people like Zhongli's shield, and he does kind of provide a budget version of what Kazuha or Sucrose brings with a shield. You know, he adds debuffs and he adds buffs for the whole team. But as you know, for speedruns, a lot of the time you don't really use Zhongli. So actually for double Hydro Hu Tao, this probably is actually one of the few times where I would say Kazuha and Sucrose are similar. And I've uploaded speedruns in the past like this. The reason Sucrose is pretty good here is because a lot of the time, because Hu Tao is very bossing focused, you don't really care that much about Kazuha's better grouping. And Sucrose does actually give a slightly higher maximum damage buff to Hu Tao, because she does have both VV and TTDS. So with this double Hydro, Sucrose is actually pretty similar, at least in clear times. However, the main reason that I used Sucrose in these videos is because Sucrose is a 4-star, so that keeps the cost of my run less than if I used Kazuha. But if you don't care about the cost, the overall runs are across abysses generally similar. However, here's the thing about Hu Tao, is that if you didn't know, double Hydro isn't actually her most optimal team. At least for most people, like I'm not talking about melt teams for whales. Like I could say Sucrose and Kazuha are similar, but actually, if you do want the highest DPS Hu Tao teams, you don't actually play double Hydro. What you do is you replace Xingqiu with Bennett. This is because you can now do Pyro VV, but also Yelan and Bennett have huge synergy. Using Bennett allows Yelan to vape her skill in the beginning of setups, and if your Yelan's highly invested, this can allow you a lot of front-loaded damage. So overall with this team is very flexible and very versatile out of all Hu Tao teams. And instead of playing Xingqiu with double Hydro, what this allows you to do is that it allows you to get more out of both Hu Tao and Yelan. It's kind of like a double hyper carry setup. I don't know how to explain it, but it's kind of like a dual carry. And because you're buffing both Hu Tao and Yelan, it scales really well with investment on them. That's the main issue with double Hydro. Whilst it's still pretty good and it's still pretty competitive, the issue is that this doesn't really give that much buffs to Hu Tao. So if you have things like Star of Homer or C1, or you just have good artifacts on Hu Tao, You get a lot less mileage out of these investments if you're playing double hydro than if you're playing VV vape. So overall, in conclusion, for Hu Tao, whilst Kazuha and Sucrose can be similar in double hydro, and whilst you can sometimes see this team being played, a lot of the time when you play Sucrose and Xingqiu and Bennett, those are runs people would do just to save on costs, just to use 4 stars. But a team like this with Kazuha is generally Hu Tao's best team, and Kazuha just works better as the animo teammate there. Okay, after Hu Tao, I guess we can just talk about a default national team. And obviously, if you've seen my channel, you've seen me do a lot of speedruns on this team, and I've actually uploaded a long guide about this team, at least how I play it. And this is one of the teams I think Sucrose and Kazuha are about the same, at least in terms of clear times, but their playstyles are slightly different. You know, Kazuha has the more consistent grouping, whereas Sucrose can be a lot more difficult to play. But here's the thing, I know some people think that this default 4-star national team is just better than Kazuha National, but from my experience, at least in terms of clear times, that's not really true. I think people focus too much on Sucrose's buffing potential and her buffing Xiangling's damage higher than Kazuha can, and thinking that that might translate into clear time. But Kazuha's more consistent grouping and the fact that he can a lot of these times use Favonia's sword, it can help this team a lot, even in speedruns. So you might be asking, if I think these teams are fairly even, then why do I keep making videos on this OG national team? And the answer might be quite obvious, is that I can play this team with 0 5-stars and without any 5-star weapons, and I can show you how to get really fast runs out of it. This team has like a very high ceiling, you might not think that, but even with 4-star weapons, this team can have a high ceiling. But you know, that's just for the video making, because I want to reduce the amount of 5-stars that I use. In these videos that I've uploaded, you could quite easily use Kazuha and get a similar end result. So I'm making videos with Sucrose for the content, but we've seen in previous abysses, sometimes Sucrose is a few seconds faster, sometimes Kazuha National is a few seconds faster. There is some back and forth, so it's hard to say that one team is better than the other. Now we can get into quicken teams, in specific, at least for my account, keqing quicken teams. Okay, so when 3.0 came out and we can now play dendro reactions, we can play quicken with spread and aggravate, there was a lot of hype around Sucrose. Both Miko and keqing now want EM, and they both want grouping, and especially Miko, who I don't actually play on this account. Miko now gets multiple value from EM scaling. So Sucrose can give these EM buffs, and she is an accessible 4-star. And I remember people were trying her initially, and even then back in 3.0, I remember some sort of feeling like there was going to be a sort of new Sumeru national team. Like you lose your 50 city, you get keqing, and then you get these 4-stars, and it worked to some sort of synergistic quicken team. And then even in the 3.0 abyss, I do remember some Miko Sucrose speedruns. It was like Miko, Kujosara, and maybe Traveler and Sucrose. But anyway, to the point, I think very quickly people began to accept that Sucrose just wasn't it, especially when you're playing keqing. Even though Sucrose can theoretically give her the buffs and give her the grouping, Kazuha just works so much better. His short cooldowns on his grouping just work so much better with keqing, especially as, if you didn't know already, keqing doesn't really have many sources of damage bonus. She has a Goblet and Thundering Fury set bonus, but her talents don't give damage bonus, which is why Kazuha synergizes very well with her. It's to the point where I think if you've played this team for a while, you will know that Sucrose's grouping can even sometimes be griefing, because the cooldowns are so long, even with sacrificial fragments, and when you're attacking enemies that are spread out with keqing, and with Fischl, who is very single target focused, it just doesn't feel good at all. In terms of buffs, Kazuha's electro damage is still very relevant for aggravate, and on top of that, he actually has very solid personal damage in these teams due to his high EM, the fact that you can sort of spam his skill, and even the electro damage buff he gives in this team, it can be buffing himself too. And even though Kazuha can sometimes have issues swirling in these teams, I'm sure people know by now, but there are plenty of setups that can get around this, and even if you don't use Nahida, these days you can also use Kiwara, you can use Baiju. But yeah, overall, I think if we're talking about quicken teams, in particular if we're talking about keqing quicken teams, you know, let's keep it 1,000. Kazuha is a big upgrade over Sucrose in these teams. And to be honest, Kazuha is probably the most important teammate for keqing in these teams. You know, you can use Fischl or Kujosara as your Electro teammate. You can use Nahida, you can use Baiju. If you're on a real budget, you can use Traveler, you can use Kiwara. But I think a lot of keqing mains would agree with me that Kazuha is keqing's probably best teammate overall. Okay, so next character, I can get into another old character, which is Diluc. His best teams, if you know what you're doing, are melt teams. I would actually like to play Diluc a lot more, but unfortunately I don't have Kyra at C6, which is when it really gets online and gets really fun. If you want to see really good Diluc gameplay, I recommend checking out this channel. So with Melt Diluc, whilst you can play Sucrose, it really is very awkward, and people know it just works a lot better with Kazuha. With Kazuha, you can do cryo absorb setup, something like this, and it just works out a lot better. Okay, another DPS, we can talk about Klee. I think this one is pretty obvious, especially if you've been watching my channel for a while. I've covered Klee Monopyro Synergy a ton in this channel, as well as a lot of gameplay. And I have covered and uploaded Sucrose in the past. And while she does work out pretty well, especially if you build her with high energy recharge, because you really need the grouping and the suction, especially because Klee has the mines that you need to suck. The issue with Sucrose, again, this is a bit of a recurring theme, is that Kazuha has much shorter cooldowns, and he has even special synergies with Klee. I've covered this in previous videos, but you can use his skill and then switch to Klee, and it will actually pull back Jumpy Dumpty, and then you can easily group up the mines after as well. While Sucrose can do this, it is a lot more scuffed, but Kazuha's other advantage is obviously his synergy with mono teams, giving the elemental damage bonus, and he can use Fav Sword to great effect in these teams, which gives these teams much more manageable and consistent energy generation. And that's another area where Sucrose might struggle, is because her burst is an 80 cost burst. So if you're playing these mono teams with Sucrose, the issue is you have to choose between TTDS for damage buffs, Favonius Codex for the team energy generation, and Sacrificial Fragments for giving her more opportunities to group. You can't have all three, and it leaves a lot of flaws whichever option you pick. She does have a C6 that gives elemental damage bonus to the team, so this can help in mono teams. However, her EM buff is pretty much wasted in these teams. So yeah, with Klee the comparison is pretty obvious. Sucrose is solid, but Kazuha there's no real comparison. I suppose I can also talk about venti Kazuha teams. These teams are very niche and I don't really play them much or recommend playing them that much. However, in events where you can need a lot of grouping, like those events that constantly spawn in enemies, you can do like aggravate teams, like something like this, and it's okay. And also sometimes you can do monopyro teams like this in the Abyss. There was a previous Abyss, I think 2.8, where this was the world record team. You also can do a monopyro team like this, but Venti has really bad synergy with xiangling, so it doesn't really work out. There are a few speedruns in the past that have done this. However, from what I remember, they generally were just slower than using either Klee instead, or just doing the monopyro team with that. So you rarely ever play both Kazuha and Venti. So in these Venti teams, you can't really do Sucrose. What actually does give EM to the team, which would both help aggravate reactions and Venti's own personal damage. The main issue is that these Venti teams really like quick swap. And again, the recurring thing with Sucrose is that her cooldowns are just really long. And although Kazuha has his own anti-synergy with Venti, which is that his skill and punch are really inconsistent at hitting enemies sucked into Venti's burst, because Kazuha has very short cooldowns on his grouping, they generally work a lot better. And similarly, it's not really a thing of doing Kazuha and Sucrose. So yeah, these sort of venti teams, not really teams I would recommend, but they are fine, mainly in events, and Sucrose isn't really a thing here. The next teams I can talk about is Ganyu. The thing with Ganyu is no one really plays her freeze teams anymore, and actually her most popular melt teams don't really use any animos. This team, similarly to Hu Tao, her most popular melt team is a team with Zhongli because of his good shield, and he does also provide small debuffs and buffs for the team. His shield is very valuable for Ganyu, especially issues at C0 because you can get interrupted when using her charge attacks. Personally, I have Ganyu at C0, I don't have her C6. But if you did have her C6, teams with Kazuha are pretty popular because you don't really need Zhongli's shield anymore. But the thing is, you wouldn't use Venti or Sucrose in this slot just because of the way Kazuha works. There are also teams with Shenhe that are playable, and again you would use Kazuha here. You can do pretty decent setups with Shenhe and Kazuha. This core can also work in burn teams. The team is pretty much this. You can't really swap anyone around, like you can't play Sucrose or Venti here, really. But I'd say overall with Ganyu, you don't really need any of the animos, really. Like I said, ever since Morgana sort of fell off, this has always been her most popular team. But like I said, the higher invested your Ganyu is, the more likely you are to switch to Kazuha, whether you're playing a team like this or whether you're playing a team like this or this. For Child, I don't really want to spend too much time on him just because I don't play him. But I think everyone knows the strength of International, and there's a reason that everyone plays International and they don't really play Sucrose or Venti in that slot. Kazuha just brings a lot of fluidity and flexibility into these teams. So even if Sucrose is able to give a higher maximum hit to xiangling, in these sorts of vape teams, then Kazuha can. Kazuha is pretty good at buffing the whole team, and like I said, the flexibility with his short cooldowns just generally ends up a lot better. And yeah, like I said, there's a reason that people play International and they don't play Sucrose vape or Venti vape. We can talk about ayaka. If you know, I've got a huge document about ayaka and I've done several guides on it on this channel and several speedruns on this channel, and for pretty much most of them I'm playing either this team or this team. This core of Shenhe, Ayaka, Kazuha is just a very fluid core, and whilst you were able to use Venti in the past, he hasn't really been getting much use with Ayaka for a long while, unless you're playing a team like this, which I personally don't play. But if you have very high investment and some constellations in these two, teams like this can be very strong. There's a lot of reasons why Kazuha synergizes extremely well with Ayaka. His cryo damage buffs help Ayaka very well because she is a hyper carry. And because of the way her burst works, you really want to have grouped enemies and ideally frozen. And Kazuha's synergy with Kokomi is very huge, especially because, like I said, he can pull enemies towards her jelly. Same thing with Shenhe's circle. Kazuha can pull enemies towards this. And this is something you can't really do with the other animos. As you may know already, one of the issues that make Venti very awkward in some freeze teams, the first issue is that his burst, he shoots ahead of you, which means sometimes you have to run back a little. And the other issue is that he targets an enemy, which means you could be targeting an enemy away from your freeze zone. These issues can also be similarly prevalent with Sucrose. But like I said, the advantage with Kazuha is that he pulls enemies towards you wherever you want to be, which means wherever you want to set up a freeze zone, you can stand there and you can pull enemies towards that, and it's very consistent. Then there's also the fact that freeze teams are pretty close to mono teams in disguise. They are very cryo damage focused, which means Kazuha's cryo damage buffs are very useful here. Venti's energy refund can be good, but like I said, he can be clunky with the way his burst works. And Sucrose can give TTDS, which is useful for Ayaka, but the issue is you usually get TTDS from either Kokomi or Mona, which means a big power budget of Sucrose's buffs is kind of not used here. We can move on to Raiden. I'm sure everyone is very familiar with this team, Raiden Hyper Carry, and it works very well with Kazuha especially. However, you can sometimes see speedruns with Sucrose, but I would tell you the main reason people use Sucrose is because, like I mentioned with Hu Tao, she is a 4-star, which means you can have 3 4-star teammates and it keeps a very low cost, especially because with Raiden, if you have her C2, she already costs 3 golds by herself, which means sometimes when the damage is enough and you want to keep the costs of your run or gameplay down, you can use Sucrose. But I think people know that Kazuha is pretty good here. However, I would like to add, a lot of people may not know this, but Raiden actually has pretty good synergy with Venti too. It's most commonly not really with Bennett, it's most commonly in a mono electro team. A lot of the time they will be using Miko here, and that's a pretty good team. But I will add these sorts of teams as Raiden, Venti, Miko. They are more like dolphin teams, so you'd want constellations on your Raiden, you'd want a high invested Venti or Miko. It's very good in AoE content, but it wouldn't be as popular or as accessible as a hypercarry team like this. I can also add that you don't really need to pay any animo here. Raiden's most popular team overall, and maybe still the most popular team in the game, is a national team, and that doesn't need any animo character. Yeah, overall Raiden is one of the most flexible characters in the game. In particular, one of the more flexible DPSs in the game. She doesn't really need any of the animo characters, but if you do want an animo character, it's most likely going to be Kazuha. It's very good synergy with her, especially as she generates lots of energy in her teams, which allows Kazuha to have much more flexibility with his weapons, and it's a lot easier to use Freedom Sworn here for even more team buffs. In Inazuma, after Ayaka and Raiden, there was Kokomi, and I've already sort of covered Kokomi with Ayaka Freeze, but Kokomi just overall has really good synergy with Kazuha. You can play a mono hydro team like this, and similarly to mono pyro, which I already covered, Kazuha is very preferred in this role over someone like Sucrose or Venti. There are also electro charge teams which you could play with Kazuha as well, maybe something like this. I can also cover electro charge teams now. So there's this taser team, which is one of the oldest teams around, but I'm gonna just be honest, like, how many people really play this anymore? I will say though that a lot of people do assume just because you can use Sucrose on field that she automatically is better than Kazuha here. But as someone who has tried speedruns in the past, but I remember there was someone who tested a bunch of different taser teams with a bunch of different animo characters and a different hydro characters. And what they found was taser teams, because they're mostly floor based with very low ceilings, actually almost all taser variations had about the same clear time. Like I said, even though Kazuha doesn't have animo infused normal attacks, without its C6 of course, because Sucrose's EM share isn't as helpful as you may think, because electro charge with these characters is not that useful, and Kazuha has more flexible grouping, and it also gives damage bonus, which is more useful to these characters than elemental mastery. Even though Sucrose is very good on field, the clear times end up about the same. But I understand this story is very anecdotal just because people don't really play these taser teams anymore. But I'm pretty confident in saying the differences are not that high, and you can play either Kazuha or Sucrose and not see that much of a difference, at least in terms of clear time. But I will say with Kokomi in particular in these kinds of teams, she definitely appreciates Kazuha's grouping and the hydro damage bonus a lot more than she would get with Sucrose, especially because you can use Kokomi on field a lot more instead. You know, driving with Kokomi and just using the animo character off field. Whether you use Kokomi on field or use an animo character on field, the clear times and DPS is overall fairly similar. These teams have such low ceilings that it's very believable that you can't really squeeze out that much DPS from these. After Kokomi there was Yelan, and I know a lot of people like to play Yelan as an off-field sub DPS or as a support, but if you heavily invest in her, like you have really good artifacts, you maybe have Aqua Simulacra, you might have a C1 or C2, but even at C0, she is very good as sort of like a main DPS, and you can play her in Mono Hydro or some sort of forward vape team, and it's almost guaranteed to use Kazuha. In fact, in her main DPS teams, Kazuha is probably the most popular teammate overall, regardless of whether you're playing a highly invested forward vape team, something like this, or something like this, or even just a national team. Kazuha is the most popular teammate in these sorts of teams. I don't think I've loaded a speedrun of these forward vape teams, but you can check out other people's channels. These sorts of teams are very popular, whether you're playing Mona or Nilu or xiangling or Bennett or Klee. These are very popular, mostly at a very high investment, but like I said, I have seen like C0 R1 or C1 R1 forward vape national teams with Yelan, and they usually use Kazuha. So I'm not really sure what other types of teams there are really, I haven't covered yet. Like I said, I know there's a common mainstream tendency to say that Sucrose is better in vape or melt teams, but I think as we've covered, it's not really the case. Like a lot of these pyro characters, if they are running vape or melt, a lot of them do have the higher ceiling teams with Kazuha rather than Sucrose. Again, it's not really because of the biggest number that you can get, but it's about the whole package, and a lot of these guys appreciate Kazuha's flexibility and well-roundedness along with his buffs. Even with melt teams, like I said, it's very mainstream to say that Sucrose is better in melt, but there aren't actually that many melt teams, and in ganyu melt, Kazuha is more popular. Even if you're playing a sort of free-to-play melt team, something like this is a very old team, although I don't think people play this that much anymore. You're more likely to slot Kazuha somewhere. Maybe you swap in Kazuha instead of Kaya, or maybe you replace Xiangling with him and you start absorbing his burst with pyro. But I have tried these sorts of reverse melt teams with Sucrose in the past, and it's very scuffed absorbing her burst with pyro in order to help reverse melt. Doesn't really work out that well, and I think you're more likely, if you don't have Kazuha, just to play no animo and just to play double cryo, double pyro. I think as far as dendro teams goes, I've covered the quicken teams with keqing or with miko, but a lot of the other popular ones, they don't really use any animo, but mostly because you can't swell dendro, so it doesn't really benefit from VV or from Kazuha's buffs. But also because of Nahida's E is very strong in AoE, and her ability to soul link enemies together, it sort of negates a lot of the need to worry too much about grouping. So yeah, that's the end of the video. It probably did sound fairly biased towards Kazuha, but it is what it is. Like I mentioned in the beginning, the way I play the game is very speedrun focused or very optimal gameplay focused. And yeah, there's a reason why Kazuha is just used a ton. That's not to say that these other animo characters are not good or not popular. But I think overall, once players got Kazuha, he just fulfills the requirements you want of an anime character and that role just so well that there's a reason why he has such high usage, and there's a reason why people gravitate towards him. His flexibility, his mechanics, it just leans so well to what you want in these sort of games. And personally, I'm not really surprised at the usage rates I see. I'm not really surprised that a lot of people find Sucrose annoying to play, or they find that Venti isn't really that useful anymore. Again, it's not that they're bad characters, but I can say the Abyss and gameplay in this game is very context based, and the game doesn't work in a vacuum. It's about seeing the content that's in front of you and figuring out how to play the content in front of you. And unfortunately, just the way it is that Kazuha's strengths and his flexibility, his advantages, are just more often than not the optimal solution in these teams or in these Abyss chambers. I hope you found this video interesting, if nothing else, and thanks for watching.